So I started off life as a biochemist at Imperial College, looking at the chemical pathology of breast cancer. I then went to St. Mary's Hospital Medical School and got my medical license, which I graduated in '95, and I keep my license active as of today. So I've had a medical career for over 30 years. I left full-time medicine in 2000, did an MBA at London Business School, and then I joined Goldman Sachs as an investment banker. I was at Goldman for a number of years, and then I went to UBS, and then we left UBS to join Blackstone to form the healthcare team at Blackstone, which we ran for a couple of years. In terms of Treehill Partners, we spun out the team from Blackstone in 2014 to form Treehill Partners. You know, despite having worked at some of the largest institutions like Goldman and UBS, where they are some of the best investment banking advisory firms, I felt that we weren't really serving the need of our clients from a healthcare perspective adequately. I felt that we could do better in a sense of, I think there was a bit of a gap between what the clients were telling us and what we were providing. So a lot of the solutions we provided were relatively off the shelf. And in our opinion is, in order to be able to serve your client, you need to actually understand the shoes they're in. So we needed to understand the scientific underpinning of a company, the drug development pathway, the medical need, and the ultimate transaction, which would be, would lead to the company being able to raise money and then potentially exit. From that perspective, what we did is we formed a team, the core of which is an investment banking team, so people who are kind of world-class investment bankers, but in addition to that, brought in-house scientific, medical, regulatory, drug development expertise, brought in people who've been former heads of M&A from large cap pharma. Typically, these are people who are our former clients, and also brought in former CEOs and chairmen of other companies who've operationally actually, had their hand on the steering wheel in taking companies through this process. So if you put all of those people together, you should be able to serve your clients better because you understand the need, and more importantly, you understand how your advice can be implemented. So this has been hard in the past 2 decades that we've seen. This has been the toughest financial environment that we've seen. I think saying that it's challenging is kind of stating the obvious. That the important bit is to understand what is the story underlying that, and what does that really mean to drug development. And the impact is, if you use the analogy of a conveyor belt, typically what you'd have is you'd have a company that was scientific that would then move on to phase 1 and phase 2, phase 3. Along the pathway would raise money and then would either license or be acquired, or the company would grow and itself become an acquirer. The financing environment has been incredibly difficult for about 3 years. So what that's led to is a conveyor belt has stopped. So there are not many companies licensing their products out. Companies that typically would have been acquired are not being acquired. So the amount of demand that's required in the market is unprecedented. Now, what does that mean for drug development? What that means is companies who've got very good science are being excluded from the financing arena because of the stage they're in. So because the older, more mature companies who are still have been on the market for a while, but haven't been able to raise money, those companies are now reducing the valuations. They are looking at more flexible transaction structures, which means that the earlier stage companies aren't really getting a look in. So from a drug development perspective, what that means is we're seeing companies who are doing drug development based on the amount of money they have. So they're doing the study they can do, as in the study they can fund, as opposed to the study that's the right study to do for that molecule. The other thing is that we're seeing is drug developers focusing on running as few studies as they can to get to the next phase. So whether it's a phase 1 or phase 2 or phase 3. And when we're advising companies, we're telling them that this environment will change and will go back to normal. The important factor here is to have the best quality of data that we're generating, as opposed to just generating data to show momentum. The difficulty that we have at the moment is, if the financing markets opened up tomorrow, so tomorrow the market went back to normal, there's probably 3 to 4 years worth of backlog in terms of companies that need to raise money. So we're not in a market where we could say, you know, is a market going to soften or green shoots of recovery are in 3 or 6 months. If the market's open today, or we will have probably 2, 3, maybe even 4 years worth of backlog of companies either looking to raise capital, follow-on capital in the markets, or looking to go public, where they actually have all of the information and data required to go public. So this is a situation we're in, and we're going to be in for a while. So the pandemic has had a number of characteristics which are quite interesting. So the first thing is that our advice to companies right at the beginning was to halt or terminate the clinical studies they were running because patients couldn't be recruited. So you couldn't actually run the study because either the patients couldn't get to the clinical trial centers or you couldn't follow them up. And a lot of studies, people spent the money, they incurred the cost. The studies then had to be terminated halfway through, and in that point, those companies have already the bullets already left the chamber, as an analogy. And then what happened is when the government stepped in and started funding a lot of the COVID studies, the financial industry that typically were the source of the funding took a bit of a step back and said, okay, well, the government's funding the COVID studies, so let's just wait for that to happen. We, at the same time, had a lot of human capital working from home. We had a lot of patients who couldn't access medical care. So a lot of diagnoses like cancer diagnoses or liver conditions or cardiac conditions were left undiagnosed. So then we had a huge wave of patients attending who all of a sudden now had these undiagnosed conditions or untreated diagnosed conditions because everyone was focused on COVID. We then didn't see the financing market come back. We didn't see the finance people step in and say, actually, I'm going to pick up the ball and run with it. So what we've had is that again, using the conveyor analogy, one of the effects each of the dominoes affected the domino before it. And what's then happened is a lot of companies who were going to start a clinical study in 2021 have spent the money on that clinical study, haven't been able to raise the next round of funding, and now with the same sort of data and people saying, well, you haven't really made any advances. And that's not really the company's fault. So in the 1,200 data points that we looked at in terms of clinical studies and how they could be optimized, about 80% of studies have 1 or 2 material points that could be materially optimized. And clinical studies, when they're run primarily to get data generation and to get regulatory approval. Where clinical studies could be optimized far beyond that is, does that actually, not in addition to the regulatory approval, which is what you absolutely need, is that does running that study give you the data to be able to run the next study? Does running that study lead to a drug that has commercial relevance? Does that study design lead to the greatest does running that study, does that maximize the commercial potential of that drug? And what we see in over 80% of cases, there is an optimization for the scientific purity and regulatory impact. There is very little optimization, or not as much optimization as one would want, for the other factors. And for drugs to be successful in this market, you need to, in addition to the generating data which leads to regulatory approval, is to think of the commercial impact and the strategic focus. And we're not suggesting that drug development is done suboptimally. What we've noticed over again, looking at 1,200 data points, is companies optimize drug development. If you think of it as an analogy, as a chain, people optimize per link of the chain. If you take a step back and look at a 10-year time frame and say, have we optimized the full chain? You'll actually see that we have optimization within each link, but you don't have optimization across the links. Where do we see the greatest number of errors? We see companies that some companies are focused on running a mission. So they have a reason why they're doing a drug. So they're trying to solve a problem, or they have a vision which they are fitting the world into. And I call those mission companies. We have a lot of companies that are led by key opinion leaders, where there is a predetermined outcome, almost expected, and we're trying to disprove that hypothesis. And we see that a lot of studies that are run by contract research organizations are incredibly well run. But contract research organizations are there to facilitate you running the study you want to run. Their job, their role isn't, and that's not what they're appointed to do, is to sit there and say, are you sure you want to run that study? If we think through it together, could we run a better study? Could we optimize the dose? Could we optimize the target product profile? Do you think this drug will be approvable? Would you think it'll be commercially impactful? And because contract research organizations are facilitators, not really thought partners, we're seeing that there's a lot of room for improvement when we look at clinical studies across a significant number of data points. The top tips of success, in my mind, is companies need to take control of the full value chain. So companies need to, there is an assumption that at some point you're going to pass the baton on to someone else. So initially you have the scientific team who do the scientific work, they run it up to phase 1, then the baton's handed on to the phase 2 and the early clinical development team, then the baton's handed on either to the later clinical development team, you bring in additional team members, or you license it out to large cap pharma, and then commercialization is typically done by the larger organizations. As we said at the beginning, the conveyor belt isn't functioning as it did before. So a lot of times companies need to look at the full value chain. They may not need to implement the full value chain, but even with preclinical companies, we work with them to identify the target product profile that they're aiming for 6 to 8 years down the road. What is your scientific and medical need that you're solving for at the time of approval? What do you think the commercial landscape will be at the time of approval? Not today, but in 8 years' time, will your drug be relevant? If you're the 10th PD-1 to the market, for example, by the time you're a preclinical company and you get a PD-1 to the market in 10 years' time, what is that PD-1 going to look like? What is the commercial potential of that? And you may be in a situation as a company where you need to hold on to that asset and run the later stage clinical studies, or you might need to take it to market yourself. Because you can't fully rely on the market coming back to normal, our advice to companies is you need to take control of the full value chain, which means the team that you have in place on day one should be a multifaceted team. And part of what we do at Treehill is to work with companies to round off the capabilities should they not have it within their own team. I think one common theme is myopia. Is in solving today's problem that doesn't necessarily leave the company in a state where they are in a position tomorrow that they have strategic optionality. So cornering the company today because that is a deal you could do, or that's a structure that you could do, or that's a data you could generate, or a decisions made based on short-term objectives as opposed to long-term vision. The other one is applying the same non-scientific rigor to the rest of the company. So, we spent a lot of time, and a lot of people at Treehill, a lot of my team at Treehill have been CEOs. So I myself have been a CEO of multiple companies, and this isn't pointing a finger, but this is what we live. Is we all look at the molecule, we all look at the development pathway, and if it fails, we blame the molecule as opposed to blame the way we've developed the drug or taking ownership. So a lot of times, I think there needs to be a rigor placed around the molecule. So assuming that we've chosen the right molecule, we're developing it, the molecule is on the right pathway and is relevant for the disease that has been targeted. What else can we optimize for? Can we optimize the selection of the CRO? Can we optimize the clinical study? Can we optimize the type of investors we have around that program that allows it to be successful? And I think that the main point there is having the self-awareness that if a program isn't hitting all of those criteria, to at that point take a very cold towel moment and think, does it make sense to continue? So we see a lot of companies where they go, look, I know there's no commercial potential for this, but the science is great. And I think that cold towel moment, which is very difficult because we're all emotionally invested in the molecule that we're developing, and also in terms of a desire to help patients. But overall, I think unless all of the stars are lined up, that program is highly unlikely to be successful. This is as difficult an environment as we're going to be in. So if we look at all of the factors that are against drug development at this point, so we're in the middle of a perfect storm. We have a difficult financing environment. We have a difficult licensing environment. We have contract research organizations that are facilitators, not thought partners. We have um, significant considerations around human capital, working from home, having, being able to travel, teams that have disbanded. We have the genericization and indication splitting. So companies, if you want to be successful in an indication, you now need a drug which is so much better than the leading drugs, a couple of years ago, or you need to be in combination therapy. So if we look at all of those together, this is as difficult an environment as we've seen over the past couple of decades, which I think is a positive. And I think going into this, we need to think of it as a positive. This is as hard as it gets, in which case, I think up to this point, we see significant finger pointing at the molecule. Well, the molecule didn't do well. If we stop doing that and we look at ourselves and we say, okay, can we pick better molecules? Can we develop the drugs better? Can we reduce, for example, in the data set that we generated, we could reduce the costs of contract research organizations by 15 to 20%. We can improve the drug development process by 9 months. 80% of those studies could be improved. We can start thinking about the target product profile with companies as early as preclinical. So if we take ownership of the fact that it may not be the molecules for all these years that have failed, but actually the humans around it that have failed. And this is as difficult as the market gets. And we need to adapt to the market, which, as we said earlier on, may be around for the next 3-4 years. I think this is an opportunity because a lot of companies won't adapt to that. And I think as long as we roll up our sleeves and have the right team around us, and we have the right ecosystem in terms of the right consultants, the right advisors, the right KOLs, etc., I think this is a great opportunity to move to the next level of drug development.